Before our daughter's graduation, my wife said, "Sit outside. Her biological father will take your seat." I said nothing. That night, I sold the apartment, canceled all cards, and disappeared. When they returned home, I had a surprise waiting for them. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. When we got home that night, the door didn't open. Susanna put the key in 3 times. 4. She turned it hard. Nothing. She looked at Ruben, who was standing by her side with his new suit and his man smile, who had won something he never deserved. Then she looked for me with her eyes, as if I were going to be there, waiting for her, as always. But I wasn't. The apartment wasn't hers anymore. The cards didn't work anymore. And the man who for 15 years paid every center of that life had disappeared without saying a single word. That was at 11 at night on Brenda's graduation day. But to understand why I did what I did, you need to know what happened hours before. Because that morning, in front of dozens of people, my wife looked me in the eyes and said, "Vicente, sit outside. Brenda's biological father is going to take your place next to me." I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't say a single word. I just grabbed my jacket, put it on slowly, and walked out. And it was in that cold hallway, sitting on a plastic chair, listening to the applause from inside, that I made the most important decision of my life. But for you to understand the weight of that moment, I need to tell you from the beginning, because this didn't start that morning. It started 15 years ago when I decided to love as if it were mine what never was. And when I decided to build a life for 2 people who, in the end, treated me as if I had never existed. My name is Vicente, I'm 44 years old, and this is the story of how I lost everything in a second and got it all back in one night. I met Susanna 17 years ago. It was an ordinary Tuesday in the elevator of an office building where we both worked. She on the 11th floor, me on the 8th. She had her hair up, a folder under her arm, and a way of looking that made you feel she always knew something you didn't. I found her fascinating. I found her confident. I found her to be everything I wanted at that moment in my life. Why I didn't see, because nobody told me, and I didn't want to ask, is that Susanna already carried a history with her. A history that included a man named Ruben, a relationship that had ended badly, and a 3-year-old girl named Brenda, who slept in a crib in her mom's room. When Susanna told me 2 months after we started dating, I didn't hesitate, I didn't walk away, I didn't set conditions. I told her it didn't matter, that I was there, that the girl had nothing to do with what I felt for her. And I meant it, because from the first time I saw Brenda, with her little pink shoes and her way of holding on her mom's finger, something in me just said, this girl needs someone, and I want to be that someone. That's how it all began. Susanna and I got married when Brenda was 4 years old. It was a simple wedding in a small hall with few people, but with a lot of emotional weight. I signed papers, not for formal adoption, because Ruben never wanted to give up his legal rights, although he never showed up, never called, never sent a single dollar for the girl's expenses. But I did show up, I did call, I did pay. From the first day I lived with Brenda, I took on everything, the diapers, the milk, the pediatrician appointments that cost $80 each time, and that we sometimes had to do twice a month. The school uniform, the supplies, the swimming lessons she asked for at age 6, and that cost $10 a month. Everything came out of my pocket. Everything came out of my work hours, my hours of sleep, my hours of silent sacrifice. And I never complained. I never passed the bill to anyone because I didn't do it out of obligation. I did it because I loved that girl as if she were my own blood. Brenda had been calling me Dad since she was 5. One day she came home from kindergarten and just said it out of the blue with that little voice she had, "You're my dad, right?" And I knelt down, looked her in the eyes, and told her yes, that I always would be. I never thought I'd tell someone that moment while crying, but here I am. Susanna, in those early years, was different. She was affectionate, grateful, present. She cooked on Sundays, waited up for me when I came home late from work. She told me she didn't know what she would have done without me. I believed her. I believed her because I wanted to believe her, because I needed to believe her, because I had built my entire adult life around that belief. We bought the apartment when Brenda was 8 years old. It was a big decision, one of those that change your life. $320,000 in a 4-story building in a quiet area of the city. I made the down payment, I signed for the loan. I paid every monthly installment for 10 years without missing a single one. The apartment was in my name, only mine. At the time, that didn't mean anything special to me. It was just a formality, a matter of credit, of banking history. Susanna didn't have her papers in order back then, so it was easier for everything to be in my name. I never imagined that detail, that small bureaucratic detail from an ordinary morning in a notary's office, would be the piece that would change everything 10 years later. But I didn't know that yet. What I did know, or thought I knew, was that I had a family, a real family, built with effort, with love, with years of constant presence. A wife who loved me, a daughter who called me dad, a home I had paid for with my own hands. What I didn't know was that someone was about to come back to reclaim it all, and that someone had the name I had learned to ignore for 15 years, Reuben. Reuben's name had floated in our house like a shadow for years. It wasn't something mentioned often, but it wasn't something that ever completely disappeared either. From time to time, Susanna would name him in some casual conversation, without giving it much weight, like someone mentioning the weather or a neighbor who no longer lives nearby. Reuben called to ask about Brenda. Reuben said he wanted to see her someday. Reuben sent a message, and I always responded the same way, calmly, maturely, with that tranquility of a man who knows what he has and doesn't need to fight to prove it. It's okay, Susanna. If Brenda wants to meet him someday, it's her right. Because I truly believed it. Brenda had the right to know who her biological father was. I didn't argue that. What I did have trouble understanding, although I never said it out loud, is why that man who had never shown up, who had never paid for anything, who had never been there for a late-night fever or a first day of school or a school play, still had a place in the conversations in my house. But I kept quiet as I always did, because back then I still believed that silence was a form of love. Brenda grew up to be a brilliant girl. It would be easy to say that and leave it, but I want you to truly understand. She wasn't just smart in school, although she was that too, with grades that were always among the highest in her class. She was brilliant in the way she saw the world. She asked questions that disarmed you. At 10, she asked me why people got married if in the end they all got sad. At 12, she asked me if it was possible to love someone without knowing them. At 14, she asked me if I had ever felt truly afraid. I told her no. I lied to her because I had felt afraid. I felt it every time Reuben appeared in a conversation. Every time Susanna mentioned him with a tone I couldn't quite decipher. Every time Brenda asked with that natural curiosity of teenagers what her biological dad was like, what he looked like, what he did for a living, I answered honestly. I don't know him well, my love, but you have every right to meet him if you want to. And then I'd change the subject, and then I'd go to the room and sit on the edge of the bed in silence, feeling something I couldn't name yet. Now, I know it was called fear, the fear of losing something you had built with everything you had. The years went by, and life continued at its own pace. I worked at a logistics company managing contracts with suppliers, traveling 2 or 3 times a year, always bringing something back for Brenda when I returned. A book, a toy, a sweatshirt from some city she had mentioned wanted to visit someday. Small gestures that to me were huge because they were the way I knew how to say, I love you without needing words. Susanna, in those middle years, was a more distant version of the woman I had met. There wasn't a big fight. There wasn't a visible crisis. It was something more subtle, harder to pinpoint, like when a painting slowly fades and you don't notice until one day you look at it and you no longer recognize the colors it used to have. She stopped waiting up for me. She stopped cooking on Sundays. The conversations became shorter, more functional, colder. Did you pay the gas bill? Brenda needs money for the field trip. My cousins are coming this weekend. Can you stay home? Nothing of substance, only surface. I noticed. Of course I noticed, but I told myself it was the normal wear and tear of the years, that every couple goes through that the important thing was to keep the home stable for Brenda, that we would have time to reconnect when she grew up and things were calmer. How naive I was. The first real sign that something was changing came about a year ago, when Brenda was in her last year of high school and was already starting to talk about graduation with that excitement young people have when they feel they're about to cross an important threshold. It was a Wednesday night after dinner. I was washing the dishes. Susanna was sitting at the table with her phone, and Brenda said from the couch, "Hey, Do you think Ruben could come to my graduation? I stood still with the plate in my hand. I didn't say anything yet. I just listened. Susanna looked up from her phone faster than usual, with an interest that seemed too immediate to me, too prepared, as if she had already thought about that possibility before Brenda said it out loud. Of course, my love. If you want to be there, I'll call him. Just like that, without consulting me, without looking at me, without even pausing to consider what that answer meant for the man who was standing 2 meters away from her washing the dishes from the dinner he had paid for in the apartment he had bought. After 16 years of being present at every important moment in that family, I finished washing the plate, dried it, put it away, and went to the living room to watch TV as if nothing had happened, but something had happened and I knew it. In the following months, Ruben's name began to appear with a frequency it didn't have before. It was no longer a casual mention from time to time. It was a constant, growing presence, settling into the conversations in my house like someone who comes to visit and little by little starts leaving their things everywhere. Susanna talked about him with Brenda at night in a low voice when they thought I was already asleep. Sometimes I would hear fragments from the hallway. He says he's changed a lot. He has a business now. He wants to really get to know you this time. And Brenda's voice, curious, excited, full of that hope children have when they imagine the absent father will finally appear and become everything they dreamed of. I would lie in bed and look at the ceiling and think about all the nights I had been there, all the mornings I had woken up before everyone else to make breakfast, all the weekends I had sacrificed outings with friends to take Brenda to her activities, all the dollars I had spent, all the personal dreams I had postponed, all the life I had built around that family that now seemed to be making space for someone else. And nobody asked me how I felt. Nobody. One afternoon, about 6 weeks before graduation, Susanna came home with a different energy, more cheerful, lighter, like when someone has just received news that fills them with joy. She went straight to the room, called Brenda, and I heard laughter and murmurs for almost an hour. When they came out, Brenda hugged me tightly and said, "Dad, Ruben is coming to the graduation. It's okay." She looked at me with those eyes I had watched grow, with that face I had seen in fevers, in tears, in first days of school, in scary nights, and joyful mornings. And I told her yes, that it was okay. I smiled at her, and at that moment, I still didn't know what Susanna had planned. I still didn't know what was going to happen to me days later in front of dozens of people. I still didn't know that the smile I gave Brenda would be the last time I acted as if everything was fine, because what was coming was not fine at all. The weeks before the graduation were the strangest I remember living inside my own home. And I say strange because there were no fights, no shouting, none of those obvious signs people associate with a family crisis. Everything on the outside seemed normal. The routine stayed the same. I got up early, made coffee, went to work. Susanna took Brenda to her last weeks of school. In the evenings, we had dinner together. Sometimes we watched something on television, and then everyone went to sleep. But there was something in the air that I couldn't ignore. It was like living inside a house that has all the lights on outside, but inside the walls are slowly moving, without anyone saying it, without anyone admitting it, without anyone daring to name what everyone is feeling. Susanna had changed, not suddenly, but in that gradual and silent way that's much harder to point out than an abrupt change. She was more attentive to her phone. She dressed up more when she went out, even for simple things like going to the supermarket. When I walked into a room where she was texting, she would put her phone away with a movement that was too quick, too conscious, too rehearsed to be casual. I saw it all and said nothing. Not because I was blind, not because I was a coward, but because a part of me still resisted believing that the woman with whom I had built 17 years of life was capable of what I was beginning to suspect. There's a difference between seeing something and wanting to see it. And I still didn't want to see it completely. One night, 3 weeks before the graduation, Brenda came into the kitchen while I was heating water for tea. She sat at the counter, rested her elbows on the surface, and looked at me in her way, direct and without beating around the bush, which I had always found to be one of the most beautiful things about her character. "Dad, are you and Ruben going to get along at the graduation?" I returned her gaze, smiled at her. "Of course, my love. That day is yours. The only thing that matters is that you're happy." She nodded, but she didn't look entirely convinced. There was something in her eyes, a small, almost invisible shadow, that told me she also felt something wasn't quite right, that she was also processing something that no one had explained to her clearly. "You gonna be okay, Dad?" It hurt more than I expected because it was a daughter's question, a question from someone who truly knows you and who can read what's behind your smile, even if you try hard to make it look perfect. I told her yes, that I was going to be perfectly fine, and I poured my tea and changed the subject. What happened the following week was what finally confirmed everything I didn't want to know. It was a Thursday afternoon. I had gotten home from work earlier because a meeting had been canceled at the last minute. I entered the apartment without making a sound, not for any particular reason, just because my hands were full with a grocery bag I had picked up on the way. Susanna was in the living room on the phone. She didn't hear me come in, and I stood still in the hallway without moving, without breathing heavily, because I heard something in her voice that I had never heard before. It was a soft, warm voice, the kind of voice one reserves for conversations you don't want anyone else to hear. I didn't hear everything, only fragments, but they were enough. "I know, but he has to understand. That day, I want you to be next to me. Seriously, he'll be fine. Don't worry about that." He. I was he. The man who paid for the apartment, where she was standing talking to another man with that voice she hadn't directed at me for years. I left the grocery bag on the hallway table without making a sound. I turned around, left the apartment, walked to the park 2 blocks away, sat on a bench, and stayed there for a long hour watching the children play, and the dogs run, and the world keep moving as if nothing was happening. No one in that park knew what I was feeling. No one could imagine it. From the outside, I was just a man sitting on a bench with a tired face. Inside, I was someone who had just accidentally heard the confirmation of something I had been denying for months. When I got back home, Susanna was in the kitchen making dinner. She greeted me normally. She asked me how my day was. I answered normally. The 3 of us had dinner together. Brenda talked about her friends, about her plans after graduation, about a movie she wanted to see that weekend, and I was present in every second of that dinner. I smiled. I asked, I answered, I passed the bread, I poured the water. Inside, something in me had finished shutting down. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't a revelation with background music and tears falling. It was something much quieter and much more permanent, like when a flame that has been burning for a long time finally consumes all the fuel it had and simply goes out. No noise, no smoke, just darkness where there was once light. That night, when Susanna was already asleep, I sat on the living room sofa with the lights off, just a street light coming in through the window. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't think about how to fix things. I didn't think about what I could do differently. I didn't think about how to save what was falling apart. I thought about myself, about what I needed, about what I deserved, about what 15 years of silence, of sacrifice, and of unconditional love had cost me, and what it meant to keep paying that price for someone who was already using my own home to plan something that completely excluded me. And there, on that sofa, in that darkness, I began to think with a clarity I hadn't felt for a long time. I started to remember details. The apartment was in my name, only mine. The main bank accounts, too. The savings I had accumulated over the years, kept in an account that Susanna knew about, but to which only I had direct access. The credit cards she used for household expenses were linked to my account. Everything, absolutely everything that sustained that life, passed through me. I didn't think of it as revenge yet. At that moment, it was just an inventory, a cold and honest review of the facts, but something in the back of my mind was already starting to calculate. I lived the following days with a calmness that surprised me. I continued with my routine. I continued to be the same person on the surface, but inside I was preparing. I didn't know exactly for what yet, because I still hoped that maybe I was wrong, maybe I was exaggerating, maybe the conversation I had overheard had an explanation I hadn't considered. I clung to that possibility until the last moment, until the morning of the graduation, because that morning, everything I had wanted to believe was not true became the clearest and most painful reality I had ever faced in my life. And it happened in front of everyone, without warning, without mercy, without the slightest consideration for 16 years of presence, of love, and of silent sacrifice. It happened in front of everyone, and I didn't say a single word, but what I did next, nobody saw that coming. The morning of Brenda's graduation dawned with a clear sun and a light breeze that made everything look brighter than usual. One of those mornings that seemed designed to be remembered, to be photographed, to be told later with a smile. The kind of morning that deserves a beautiful story. What nobody knew was that this morning was going to be the stage for the most painful story of my life. I got up at 6, as always. I made coffee, heated bread, set the table. I heard Brenda moving in her room with that nervous and excited energy that young people have when they know something important is about to happen. I heard her talking to herself, singing a little, opening and closing drawers, looking for something that was probably right in front of her, and she couldn't see because of her nerves. I peeked into her room and saw her in front of the mirror with her graduation gown on over her clothes, trying on, adjusting the cap with an expression between serious and excited that broke my heart in the most beautiful way possible. She turned and saw me standing in the doorway. "How do I look, Dad?" I had to take a breath before answering, because in that moment I saw her as she was. No longer the little girl with pink shoes who had grabbed my finger that first time. She was a young, intelligent, brilliant woman, ready to cross a threshold that would open the world to her. And I had been there for every step of the way that had brought her to this moment. "You look incredible, my love. I'm so proud of you." She smiled, took off the gown to finish getting ready, and told me that breakfast smelled good. And I went back to the kitchen with that sweet and bittersweet weight that only parents understand when they know their children are about to grow up in a way that will take them far. Susanna got up 40 minutes later. She came into the kitchen already dressed in a navy blue dress I hadn't seen on her before, her hair down with waves, new perfume. She poured herself coffee without greeting me, with more than a vague nod, and stood looking at her phone at the counter. "What time do we get to the auditorium?" I asked her. "At 9:30, Ruben will meet us at the entrance." She said it just like that, without looking up, without pausing, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, as if bringing your daughter's biological father to meet your husband at the entrance of an auditorium on the most important day of the year was just any logistical detail. Like confirming the parking schedule. I nodded, drank my coffee, said nothing. We left the house at 9:10. Brenda was in the back seat of the car, nervous and excited, talking about her friends, the ceremony, the party they had planned for after. I drove. Susanna was in the passenger seat looking at her phone for almost the entire ride, writing messages with a concentration I already knew exactly who it was for. We arrived at the auditorium at 9:20. The place was already full of families, balloons, flowers, cameras, of that collective and noisy energy of graduation days. Parents taking pictures, grandmothers crying before it even started, groups of young people in their gowns running to hug each other before they were arranged in their rows. Brenda got out of the car and was almost immediately surrounded by 3 of her friends who were waiting for her. She walked away with them towards a graduate's entrance, turned once to look at us, and blew us a kiss. I caught it in the air and sent one back. It was the last time I felt completely at peace that day, because when I turned around, I saw Ruben. He was standing by the main entrance, in a dark gray suit that looked expensive, his hair well-combed. A smile of a man who arrives to claim something he abandoned 15 years ago and now suddenly finds it convenient to want again. He was taller than I had imagined, more self-assured, with that attitude of someone who has never paid the consequences of his own decisions and therefore walks through the world without the weight the rest of us carry. Susanna saw him at the same time I did, and something in her changed immediately in a way I hadn't seen in years. Her eyes lit up. She smiled in a way she hadn't smiled at me in a long time. She quickened her pace, greeted him with a hug that lasted too long to be just a greeting. I stood a few meters away with my hands in my pockets, watching, waiting, telling myself I was going to stay calm, that this day was Brenda's day, that she was the important one, that I could handle this. Ruben looked at me, extended his hand. "Vicente, right? Nice to meet you." I shook his hand back. Equally. 2 words. That was all I could manage, because in that moment, looking him in the eyes, I understood all at once everything I've been avoiding understanding for months. The way Susanna was standing next to him, the way she looked at him The way her whole body seemed more relaxed, more alive, more present than at any recent moment I could remember with me. We entered the auditorium. It was a large space with long rows of chairs arranged in front of a stage with flowers and a podium. Families were filling the seats quickly. Susanna walked ahead with Ruben, talking in a low voice, pointing towards the central area where the chairs had a better view. They found a row with 3 seats together. Susanna went in first. Ruben sat next to her. I approached to sit on the other side of Susanna. And that's when it happened. Susanna turned to me, looked me directly in the eyes, and with a completely calm, completely cold voice, completely devoid of any consideration for what those words meant, she said, "Vicente, sit outside. Brenda's biological father is going to take your place next to me." The world didn't stop. That only happens in movies. In real life, the world keeps moving with a brutal indifference while everything inside you collapses. Families kept arriving. Laughter kept sounding. The background music that someone had put on to set the mood for the wait continued. Everything was exactly the same. Only I had changed in a fraction of a second. I felt the impact of those words in my chest like something physical, as if someone had pushed me without touching me. It wasn't just the pain of the sentence itself. It was everything it represented. It was 15 years summed up in one instruction. Sit outside. You don't belong here. Your place doesn't exist. What you built, what you paid for, what you loved, what you sacrificed doesn't count. It never counted. The people in the nearby rows had heard. Some are looking. An elderly woman sitting 2 seats away looked at me with an expression that mixed discomfort and pity in equal parts. I didn't explode. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't say a single word. I looked at Susanna for exactly 3 seconds. Then I looked at Ruben, who had his eyes fixed forward with that attitude of a man pretending not to hear what he clearly just heard. Then I looked back at Susanna and smiled at her. A small, calm smile, one of those that are more terrifying than any shout, because no one knows exactly what they mean. I straightened my jacket, turned around, and walked towards the side aisle, where there was a row of white plastic chairs set up for staff and photographers. I sat there alone while inside. In the central row with the best view, my wife and the man who had never been there settled in together to watch the daughter I had raised graduate. From my aisle chair, I could see the stage perfectly. I could see the row where Susanna and Ruben were sitting. I could see the look of satisfaction on her face, that expression of someone who has just done exactly what she wanted to do. And I could see the back of Ruben's neck, that man who had shown up in his gray suit and his last-minute smile to claim a title he hadn't earned. And as I watched them, as I listened to the murmur of the filling auditorium, as I waited for the ceremony that I had financed, that I had dreamed of, that I had imagined hundreds of times in a completely different way than this, I took my phone out of my pocket and started making calls. The first was to Julio. "I need you to be available tonight. I have something important to handle." Julio didn't ask anything. He just said, "I'm here." I hung up. I put the phone away. I looked up just in time to see Brenda walk onto the stage with her group, searching the audience with her eyes, looking for me, looking for her dad's face in the crowd. She found me. She saw me sitting in the aisle. I saw how her expression changed, how a brief shadow crossed her face before she replaced it with the smile she had to have that day. I gave her a thumbs up, smiled at her with all I had left. She nodded and continued walking to her place on the stage. And I sat there in that aisle chair with the phone in my hand, with the decision already made, with the plan already starting to move in my head with a cold and absolute clarity. No one in that auditorium knew what was going to happen before the day ended. No one except me. The ceremony lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. I counted them not because I was impatient for it to end, but because my mind was working on 2 levels at the same time. On one hand, I was present in every second of that stage, watching Brenda walk to the podium, receive her diploma, shake the principal's hand, move the tassel of her cap from one side to the other with that huge smile that lit up her entire face. On the other hand, somewhere deeper and colder in my head, the gears never stopped moving, calculating, organizing, deciding. There was a moment near the middle of the ceremony when Brenda looked from my eyes from the stage. She found me in the aisle, in my white plastic chair, separated from the rest of the families, away from the place where I should have been sitting, and I saw something in her face that I had a hard time holding her gaze. It wasn't anger, it wasn't shame, it was something worse. It was confusion mixed with pity. The expression of someone who understands that something is wrong, but doesn't know exactly what or exactly why or exactly who to point at. I held her gaze, smiled, nodded slowly as if to say without words that I was fine, that she didn't have to worry, that this day was hers and only hers. She nodded too and turned back to the front. But I knew in that moment that Brenda wasn't part of what Susanna had done. Brenda was a victim of this as much as I was, though in a different way. She had grown up loving her biological father with that idealization that children have when the absent parent becomes a romantic mystery instead of a concrete reality. Reuben had been for years a diffuse, almost mythical figure, built more by what he hadn't done than by what he had. And now that he had appeared with his gray suit and his late promises, Brenda was living the fantasy she had imagined as a child. I didn't resent her for that. I couldn't, because I understood her perfectly. What I couldn't understand, what I wasn't willing to continue tolerating, was Susanna, because Susanna wasn't a child with a fantasy. Susanna was an adult woman who had made conscious decisions, who had chosen on the most symbolic day of the year to humiliate me in front of dozens of people, who had decided that 16 years of presence, of sacrifice, and of unconditional love were worth less than the last-minute appearance of a man who hadn't paid a single dollar in all that time. I wouldn't forget that. I was not going to forget that. When the ceremony ended, the auditorium turned into that happy and noisy chaos that characterizes graduation endings. Families looking for each other in the crowd, impromptu photographers in every corner, flowers and balloons moving above heads like a floating, messy garden. I got up from my aisle chair and went straight to find Brenda. I found her with her friends, no longer in her gown, with bright eyes and cheeks flushed with emotion. When she saw me, she separated from the group and came towards me. I hugged her tight, very tight, one of those hugs that last longer than normal because you need to save something of that moment for when it's gone. "I'm so proud of you," I said in her ear. "Of everything you are, of everything you're going to do." She squeezed me tighter. "Thank you, Dad, for everything, for everything." Two small words that carried 15 years inside them. I knew she knew that somewhere beyond surnames and biology, she knew who had really been there. I separated from her when Susanna and Reuben approached. Reuben put a hand on Brenda's shoulder with that forced familiarity of someone trying to act like something he hasn't yet earned the right to be. Brenda smiled, a little uncomfortable, a little excited, navigating that new territory with the honest clumsiness of someone who genuinely doesn't know how to move in it. Susanna took out her phone to take pictures. Pictures of Brenda with Reuben, pictures of the three of them together, her, Reuben, and Brenda, forming a picture that excluded me as naturally as if I had never existed. No one asked me to join any photo. I stood to the side, observing, with my hands in my pockets, with the same cold calm I had had since the moment they asked me to sit outside. And it was in that instant, watching that scene, watching Susanna laugh with Reuben while Brenda posed with her diploma, that something finally solidified in me. It wasn't rage. Rage is hot and messy, and what I felt was nothing like that. It was something much colder, much clearer, much more dangerous for the person who had provoked it in me. It was determination. I excused myself in a low voice. I said I was going to the bathroom and walked away from the group. I found a quiet corner in the outer corridor of the auditorium next to a window that overlooked a small, neglected garden. I took out my phone. I called Julio again. "Are you still available?" "I'm here, brother. What do you need?" "I need you to go to the apartment. I'm going to send you a message with what you have to do. You could be there in an hour." There was a brief pause. Julio had known me for over 20 years. He knew my voice. He could tell when I was being casual and when I was being dead serious. "I'm on my way," he said. "No more questions." I hung up and started writing the longest message I had ever sent Julio in our entire friendship. I explained what I needed. I explained the steps. I sent him the data he needed, the contacts, the documents that were in the desk drawer of the guest room. where I had kept everything important for years in a blue folder that Susanna knew existed, but to which she had never paid enough attention. I put the phone away, took a deep breath, and went back to the group. The plan for the rest of the afternoon was to go to a restaurant to celebrate. Susanna had organized it weeks before. She had reserved a table for 4. She had chosen the place. She had confirmed everything with the energy of someone planning something that matters a lot to them. For places, Susanna, Brenda, Ruben, and me. Or at least that had been the original plan. During lunch, I was the calmest man at that table. I ordered what I wanted, ate slowly. I answered when spoken to. I asked the right questions at the right times. Brenda talked about her plans, about college, about a trip she wanted to take before starting the next cycle of her life. Ruben nodded and made comments like a man, trying to seem interested in a story he hadn't been a part of. Susanna looked at me from time to time with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't regret. It was something more like surveillance, like someone waiting for a reaction that wasn't coming and didn't know if that was a good or a bad sign. I gave her no sign, absolutely none. At one point during lunch, while Brenda and Ruben were talking about something, Susanna leaned slightly towards me and said in a low voice, "You don't have to be like this, Vicente. It's just for Brenda's sake." I looked at her. I waited a second before answering. "I'm not being any way, Susanna. I'm perfectly fine." She studied my face, looking for something. Anger, pain, sarcasm, anything that would tell her I was reacting the way she expected. She found nothing. She went back to her conversation. What she didn't know was that while we were sitting in that restaurant, while she was making sure Ruben felt comfortable and welcome at the celebration of the most important day of the year, I was receiving messages from Julio with updates. Message from Julio, 2:47 p.m. I'm at the apartment. I have the folder. Message from Julio, 3:10 p.m. I spoke with the contact. He says he can move today if the papers are in order. Message from Julio, 3:42 p.m. Everything's in order. Awaiting your confirmation. I read that last message under the table with the phone resting on my thigh, while Susanna asked the waiter for another glass of wine and Brenda laughed at something Ruben had said. I wrote a single word. Confirmed. I put the phone away, looked up, took a sip of water, and continued sitting at that table with the same calmness I had been sitting with in the plastic chair in the aisle, with the same calmness I had listened to them ask me to sit outside, with the same calmness that had been my only shield and my only weapon throughout that entire day. Lunch ended around 5 in the afternoon. Outside, the sun was still high, but it already had that long, golden hue of afternoons starting to lean towards night. Susanna said that Brenda wanted to spend the afternoon with Ruben, that they were going to go for a walk, that they would get home later. She told me this as information, not as a question, like someone announcing a plan that's already decided and requires no one else's opinion. Okay, I said. I'm going home. I said goodbye to Brenda with another hug. I told her I loved her. She said it back. I said goodbye to Susanna with a quick kiss on the cheek, which she received with the same distance she had received everything from me for years. I didn't shake Ruben's hand. I walked to the car, started it, and as I drove away from the restaurant, I dialed Julio's number. How's it going? All set, Vicente. Just need the final signature. I'm on my way. I hung up, drove in silence for 20 minutes. No music, no radio, just the sound of the engine and the noise of the city outside and my own thoughts inside, ordered cold, completely decided. When I got to the building, Julio was waiting for me in the lobby with the blue folder under his arm and the serious face of someone who understands he's witnessing something important. He handed it to me. I opened it. I checked every paper. Everything was in order. I went up to the apartment for the last time. The apartment was silent when I entered. A different silence than usual, denser, more conscious, as if the place itself knew that something was about to change forever. The afternoon light came through the living room windows, drawing long, golden stripes on the wooden floor that I had had installed 6 years ago, because Susanna had asked for it one Sunday while we were drinking coffee and looking at a decoration magazine. I stood at the entrance for a few seconds, just looking. I looked at the sofa where the three of us had watched movies for years, the dining table where we had eaten thousands of dinners, the bookshelf full of books that no one read, but that Susanna had insisted on putting up because they looked good. The frame with the picture of Brenda at 8 years old on the beach, with her feet buried in the sand and a smile that took up her whole face. I took it down, wrapped it carefully in a magazine that was on the table, and put it in my bag. That was the only thing I needed to take with me. Everything else was wood, fabric, glass, concrete, things you buy, things you replace. What you can't replace is time, years, sacrifices, the constant presence of someone who chose to be there when no one demanded it. That wasn't staying in that apartment. I was taking that with me, inside, where no one could take it from me. I walked to the desk in the guest room. I sat down, turned on the computer, and for the next hour and a half, I did what I had to do with the same methodical concentration with which I had always handled my important affairs. The first was the apartment. Julio's contact was a real estate agent I had worked with years ago when we bought a small property that we later sold. He was efficient, discreet, and knew that in the current market, certain operations could move quickly if the papers were clean and the owner was determined. The apartment was entirely in my name. There was no co-ownership, no outstanding debt. I had finished paying off the loan 16 months ago. It was mine in every possible legal sense. The operation wasn't a traditional sale with a 30-day closing. It was a transfer agreement with an immediate down payment and an express closing, the type of move used when someone needs quick liquidity and the buyer wants to secure the property before another offer appears. The buyer, in this case, was a real estate investment company that Julio's contact frequently worked with. The price wasn't the maximum I could have gotten on the open market, but it was fair. $340,000 with a 30% down payment transferred that same night, and the rest at the formal closing within 10 business days. I signed the digital documents, sent them. I received the confirmation 20 minutes later. The apartment was no longer mine, but it wasn't Susanna's either. The second were the cards. Susanna had 3 cards linked to my main account. One she used for household expenses, groceries, utilities, that sort of thing. A second one she used for her personal expenses, clothes, outings, things for herself. And a third one that was theoretically for emergencies, but which in practice she used for anything she didn't want to see on the statement of the other. I called the bank, gave my details, verified my identity, and canceled all 3. The bank agent asked if there was any problem with the services. I told him no, that it was a personal decision. He processed the cancellation without further questions. The third was the shared account. We had a joint account where I deposited a fixed amount monthly for household expenses. It was an account that we could both use, but which I exclusively funded with my income. The balance that afternoon was $4,300. I transferred the full balance to my personal account and then closed the joint account. Another call, another verification, another process completed in less than 15 minutes. The fourth was my personal savings account. That was where I kept what I had been accumulating over the years with a discipline that had cost me many sacrifices. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to start over, enough to live without worries while I reorganized my life. I transferred everything to a new account I had opened that same week at a different bank in my name only, with no link to any of the previous accounts. Julio had helped me with that step 2 days before, when I had told him what was happening, not with all the details, but with enough for him to understand the direction things were going. He had said only one thing: Vicente, protect yourself, do it right, and do it before they make a move first. And that's what I was doing. When I finished with the accounts, I leaned back for a moment in the desk chair and looked at the ceiling. I didn't feel euphoria. I didn't feel hot revenge or dramatic satisfaction. What I felt was something much stranger and much deeper. I felt relief, like when you've been carrying something very heavy for too long and you finally let it go. Not because you don't care anymore, but because you understand that continuing to carry it doesn't lead you anywhere worth going. I got up, went to the master bedroom, took a travel bag from the closet, and packed the essentials, clothes for several days. My important documents, passport, birth certificate, proofs of payment, everything I kept in the drawer on my side of the bed, and that Susanna had never considered relevant to know about, my personal computer, the charger, the book I was reading. One of those books you start and abandon and pick up again depending on what you're going through, and which at that moment I felt I was finally going to be able to finish. I closed the bag. I walked through the apartment one last time, slowly without rushing. I passed by Brenda's room and stopped at the door. I didn't go in, I just looked from the outside at that space she had inhabited for 15 years, with her things, her memories, her life built in layers upon layers of ordinary days that together formed something extraordinary. I wished her the best in silence, truly, without bitterness, because Brenda hadn't betrayed me. Brenda was a daughter searching for her full story, as any person has the right to be. What would happen to her in the coming days was going to be difficult, and I felt for her, but I couldn't protect her from the consequences of her mother's decisions. That was no longer my responsibility. I closed her bedroom door, went to the entrance, put on my jacket, grabbed the bag, and took the apartment keys from the small table by the door, the keychain with the brown leather key holder that Brenda had given me for Father's Day when she was 12 and from which hung the apartment key, the mailbox key, and an old key to the previous car that I had never removed because I was too lazy. I took them off the key holder, left them on the table. I kept the leather key holder, which is that I left, closed the door, walked down the stairs on foot without taking the elevator, listening to the sound of my own steps on the concrete stairs of the building that had been my home for 11 years. 11 years of Sundays, of winters, of small arguments and great joys, and endless routines that together had formed what I called my life. When I reached the lobby, Julio was waiting for me by the entrance, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his face of a man who doesn't say much but is always exactly where he needs to be. He looked at me, looked at the bag, looked at me again. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," I said. We went out together into the night air. It was almost 10. The city continued with its usual background noise, cars, distant voices, the constant hum of a place where people live crowded and parallel, knowing almost nothing about what's happening to the person next to them. I got into Julio's car, put the bag in the back seat, buckled my seatbelt. Julio started the car without saying anything. He drove for 2 blocks in silence. Then he asked, "How are you?" I really thought about the answer before giving it. I didn't want to say something automatic, something polite, something that sounded good, but wasn't honest. "I'm calm," I said finally, which is the strangest part of it all. I thought I'd be devastated, but I'm calm. Julio nodded slowly. "That's because you did the right thing." I didn't answer. I looked out the window as the building of my life for the last 11 years receded in the rearview mirror until it turned a corner and disappeared. I didn't turn to look at it. There was nothing more to see there. What was coming was ahead. And while Julio drove to his house, where I was going to stay for the necessary days for everything to settle, my phone vibrated with a message from Susanna. "We're on our way home. Are you there?" I read it. I put it away without replying. 40 minutes later, it vibrated again. "Vicente, the key isn't working. What's going on?" I read it. I put it away. Then it vibrated again and again and again. I left the phone face down on the seat and looked ahead at the illuminated street that stretched out before us, at everything I didn't yet know was going to happen, but which for the first time in a long time I felt I could face. Because I was no longer carrying the weight of a life that didn't belong to me. For the first time in 15 years, I was only carrying my own. That night, I slept in the guest room of Julio's house, a small room with a single bed, a window that overlooked an inner courtyard, and a bedside lamp that cast a calm, yellow light on the white walls. It wasn't my apartment, it wasn't my bed, it wasn't the space I had inhabited for 11 years, and yet I slept better than I had in the last 6 months. Not right away, not without thoughts, but I slept with that kind of heavy, honest sleep that comes when the body finally understands that it no longer has to be on guard, that it no longer has to prepare for anything, that the decision is made, and that what follows, however it comes, is now manageable. I woke up at 7:15 in the morning. A gray, calm light from a cloudy morning came through the courtyard window. I heard Julio moving in the kitchen, the sound of coffee, the familiar domestic noise of someone preparing for the start of the day. I lay in bed for a few minutes looking at the ceiling, thinking, not with anguish, but with that strange clarity that sometimes comes after the most difficult nights, as if sleep had sorted everything that the previous day had jumbled. I thought of Susanna standing in front of the apartment door the night before. I thought of her face when the key didn't work. I thought of the exact moment she would have understood that it wasn't a problem with the lock, but something much more definitive, much more calculated, much more irreversible than any mechanical problem could be. I thought of Ruben standing beside her, in his gray suit, now wrinkled from the day, not knowing exactly what was happening, but with enough basic intelligence to understand that the situation he was in was not convenient for him. I thought of Brenda. That was the hardest part, because Brenda was going to wake up that morning somewhere that wasn't her home, without fully understanding why, with questions that no one would be able to answer in a way that wouldn't hurt her. And that weighed on me, not with guilt, because I hadn't started any of this. I hadn't chosen any of the circumstances that had brought us to this point. But it weighed on me with that specific sadness you feel when someone you love is going to suffer the consequences of something you couldn't prevent. I got up, showered, put on clean clothes from the bag I'd brought, and went out to the kitchen where Julio already had 2 cups of coffee served on the table, as if he knew exactly when I would appear. We sat, drank coffee in silence for a while. Julio had that quality of true friends, of knowing when to talk and when to just be there without filling the silence with useless words. He was the one who spoke first. How many messages? I unlocked the phone and counted. 17 messages from Susanna between 10:30 at night and 2 in the morning. 4 missed calls, 2 voicemails I hadn't listened to yet, and 1 message from Brenda sent at 1:20 in the morning that simply said, "Dad, are you okay? What's going on?" I showed the screen to Julio. He nodded slowly. "You're going to answer, Brenda?" "Yes." To Susanna, "Not yet." I wrote a short message to Brenda. "I'm okay, my love. Don't worry about me. When you're ready to talk, I'll be here. I love you." I sent it, saw it was delivered, put the phone away, then opened Susanna's messages, not to reply yet, but to understand the chronology of what had happened the night before from her perspective. The first, sent at 10:42, was curt and confused. "Vicente, the key isn't working. What's going on?" The second, 3 minutes later, already with more urgency. "Call me. We can't get in." The third was longer, more nervous, explaining that they had tried the key several times, that the neighbor downstairs had told them he didn't know anything, that they didn't understand what was happening. The following messages escalated, from bewilderment to irritation, from irritation to confusion, and from confusion to something I read between the lines of her words that was the closest thing to fear that Susanna was capable of expressing without directly admitting it. Around midnight, her messages changed tone. They no longer asked what had happened to the lock. They began to ask where I was, if I was okay, if something had happened, with that peculiar mix of genuine concern and calculation that characterizes someone who begins to understand that they might have messed up more deeply than they had calculated. The last message, sent at 1:57 in the morning, said, "Vicente, I need you to call me. This makes no sense. We're at my sister's house. Brenda is worried. Please call." I read it twice, closed it. I put the phone face down on the table. Julio was looking at me. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Today I have to talk to a lawyer." I said, "I need to understand my options before I talk to her." Julio nodded. "I have a contact. Good, discreet. Want me to call him?" "Yes." While Julio made the call, I drank the rest of my coffee and stared out the kitchen window at the outer courtyard, where a small, stubborn tree had managed to grow between the concrete with an obstinacy that at that moment seemed to me the most beautiful thing I'd seen in a long time. The appointment with the lawyer was that same afternoon. Veronica, that was her name, a woman in her 50s with short hair and a way of speaking that was direct and unadorned, which I liked from the first minute. Julio had worked with her on a family inheritance matter years ago and had described her as someone who didn't waste time and who knew exactly which side of the line to stand on in every situation. I explained everything from the beginning, with dates, with details, with the documents I had brought in my blue folder. She listened without interrupting, taking notes with a black pen in a lined notebook, nodding from time to time with that concentrated expression of someone who is building a complete picture before making any judgment. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me directly. "Legally, you're in a solid position," she said. "The apartment was exclusively in your name. The sale is valid. The accounts were yours. There's nothing she can easily reverse without a long and costly process that, given the background you've described, has very little chance of succeeding. I breathed. What you do need to prepare for, she continued, is the formal separation process. If you've been together for 17 years and there are shared assets beyond the apartment, that will require negotiation. But the position from which you negotiate is considerably better than hers. I asked about Brenda, if there were any legal implications related to her, given that I had never formalized the adoption, but had been her de facto father for 15 years. Veronica thought for a moment. Without formal adoption, legally, Brenda is not your daughter. That means you have no legal obligations towards her going forward, but you also have no legal rights to protect in that regard. What you do have, and here she paused briefly, is a real emotional relationship that no paper can create or destroy. That's yours and hers, regardless of what any document says. I was quiet with that for a moment. She was right. I left Veronica's office with more clarity than I had had in weeks. Not because everything was resolved, because it wasn't, but because for the first time, I had a map. I knew where I stood, I knew what ground I was on, and I knew the ground was firm. That night, back in Julio's room, I decided it was time to answer Susanna. Not because I owed her an explanation, not because I felt guilty, but because there were things that needed to be said clearly, face to face, without the ambiguity that had characterized too many years of that relationship. I wrote her a long message, without shouting, without insults, without drama, with the same cold calm I had maintained throughout the previous day. I told her that the apartment had been sold and that she would receive formal notification in the coming days through the appropriate legal channels. I told her that the cards had been canceled and that the joint account had been closed. I told her that I had spoken with a lawyer and that the formal separation process would begin in the coming days. And at the end, I told her something I had been holding back for a long time. I told her that for 16 years I had chosen to be there, that no one had forced me, that no one had asked me to stay, that I had chosen it every day because I loved that family with everything I had, and that the day before, in front of dozens of people, she had chosen to tell me that that love wasn't even worth a seat in the row where the real family sat. I told her I respected her choice and that I had made mine. I sent the message, put the phone on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and in the quiet darkness of that small room that wasn't mine, I closed my eyes. I didn't wait for a reply that night. I didn't need one. Susanna's reply came at 6:43 the next morning. I saw it while I was still in bed, with the gray light of another cloudy dawn coming through the courtyard window. The phone vibrated on a nightstand, and Susanna's name appeared on the screen with that neutral coldness that notifications have when they don't know the weight of what they're announcing. I opened it. It was long, much longer than I expected. And as I read it, sitting on the edge of the bed with my bare feet on the cold floor, I understood that Susanna had spent the entire night composing that message with the same desperate energy of someone trying to stop a flood with their bare hands. It began with anger. She accused me of acting irrationally, of making unilateral decisions without talking to her, of overreacting to something that, according to her, had simply been a practical decision so that Brenda could have a special day without unnecessary tension. She used the word disproportionate 3 times in the first 2 paragraphs, as if the problem were the scale of my reaction and not the nature of what she had done. Then the tone changed. It became softer, more calculated. With that transition, I know well in people who know that anger isn't working for them and decide to try another tool. She reminded me of the years we had spent together. She told me that I was important to Brenda, that Brenda needed me, that what I had done was going to affect our daughter in ways I wasn't considering in my current emotional state. Our daughter, she used those words. Our daughter, after having told me the day before to sit outside because the real father needed the spot, I kept reading. Towards the end, the message changed tone again. There was something that resembled an apology, but didn't quite make it. That kind of half-hearted regret that doesn't acknowledge the real damage, but only the inconvenient consequences of having caused it. She told me that maybe she had expressed herself badly, that she hadn't wanted to hurt me, that things had gotten complicated with Ruben's arrival, and that she had only tried to handle a difficult situation in the best way she could. In the best way she could. I closed the message, put it face down on the bed, and sat in silence for several minutes, processing not so much what she had said, but what she hadn't said. At no point in the long, carefully constructed message that Susanna had spent the night writing was there a single sentence that acknowledged what I had given for 15 years. There wasn't a single acknowledgement of the sacrifice, of the presence, of the thousands of dollars spent, of the thousands of hours invested, of the decision I had made every morning to choose that family over anything else. There were only justifications, strategies, attempts to regain ground. It was the final confirmation of something I had taken too long to accept. Susanna wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry for the consequences. There's a huge difference between those two things, and that difference changes everything. I got up, showered, went out to the kitchen. Julio was already there as always, with the coffee ready and his calm presence that in those days felt like the most solid anchor I had. I told him the content of the message while we had coffee. He listened without interrupting. When I finished talking, he was silent for a moment, looking at his cup. Then he said something that stuck with me. People only apologize when they lose something they care about, not when they understand the damage they caused. Those are two different things, Vicente. And you already know which of the two this is. I didn't reply, but I knew. I had known since I read the message. I just needed to hear it from someone else for it to finally sink in. That day was the first one I started moving the pieces forward instead of just moving away from what was left behind. I called Veronica, the lawyer, and informed her that I was ready to start the formal process. She told me the next steps, the documents I needed to gather, the approximate timelines, the available options. I took notes, asked questions, was methodical and cold, as I had learned to be in the last few days, because it was the only way to move forward without the emotional weight of everything I was processing paralyzing me. In the afternoon, I received a message for Brenda. It was different from Susanna's, shorter, more honest, without strategy and without calculation. Just the direct voice of an 18-year-old girl who was confused and scared and didn't know exactly what had happened, but felt that something important had broken and wanted to understand. Dad, can we talk? Not on the phone, in person, please. I read it 3 times. I felt the weight of those words in a different way than I had felt Susanna's. Because this wasn't manipulation or strategy, it was simply a daughter looking for her father in the middle of a chaos she hadn't created. I replied immediately, "Of course, my love. Tell me when and where, and I'll be there." We agreed to meet the next day at a coffee shop a few blocks from Susanna's sister's house, where Brenda had stayed that night. Neutral, without the weight of any space that belonged to either of us. That night, while trying to sleep, I allowed myself, for the first time since I had left the apartment, to feel everything I've been holding in with so much discipline for the past few days. Not in a messy way, not with screams in the dark, or with the kind of crying that leaves you worse off than you were, but in a quieter, deeper way, like letting water find its own level after something has stirred it up. I thought of all the Sundays, all the mornings of coffee made before anyone woke up, all the nights of fever, and all the mornings of first days of school, and all the afternoons of homework, and all the times Brenda had looked for me with her eyes in a crowded room, and I had been there, right there, where a father is supposed to be. I thought of the $320,000 I had paid for that apartment, installment by installment, for 10 years, of the $10 a month for swimming lessons, of the trip to Mexico City we had taken when Brenda was 14, which had cost almost $2,000, and which she still remembered as one of the best times of her life. Of the birthday presents and Christmas presents, and the just because presents I brought back from my work trips because I liked to see her face when she opened something she wasn't expecting, of all that, of the real, concrete, and measurable weight of 15 years of active love, and I let it pass. Not to forget it, but to release the anger that was still attached to those memories, and keep only what they really were. Good moments, real moments, moments that had happened and that no one could erase regardless of what happened next. That was mine forever. The morning of the meeting with Brenda, I woke up early and arrived at the coffee shop 20 minutes before the agreed time. I ordered coffee, sat by the window, watched the street. Brenda arrived on time. I saw her walk through the door with her way of walking, direct and purposeful, which I had always found to be one of her most defining traits. She looked tired, her eyes a little swollen from not having slept well for several days, with that expression of contained effort of someone who is trying to maintain composure in a situation they don't quite know how to handle. She saw me, walked to the table, sat down in front of me. We looked at each other for a moment in silence. Then she said, "Why?" A single word, but loaded with everything, with confusion, with fear, with the pain of someone who feels that something they thought was solid has moved under their feet without warning. I took a breath. "Do you want the short answer or the full answer?" "The full one," she said without hesitation. And I gave it to her. I told her everything, not with anger, not with the goal of turning her against her mother, but with the honesty I owed someone who had called me dad for 15 years and who deserved to know the truth of the facts without filters or convenient versions. I told her what I had heard on the phone weeks before. I told her what I had felt in the auditorium. I told her what their words had done to me and what I had decided to do from that moment on. I told her the steps I had taken, the reasons behind each one, the cold and necessary logic of protecting myself after years of not having done so. She listened to everything without interrupting, her eyes fixed on me, moist but controlled, with that maturity she had always had and that at that moment seemed greater than ever. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then Brenda looked down at the table, moved the coffee cup that the waiter had brought her without me noticing. She held it with both hands, as if looking for some warmth from the ceramic, and said, "I'm sorry, Dad." 2 words, the same 2 words that her mother hadn't been able to say in the entire long message from the previous morning. Without justifications, without conditions, without the weight of any agenda, just that. I felt something inside me that had been tight for days finally give a little. "You have nothing to be sorry for," I told her. "You didn't do anything." "I know," she said, "but I'm sorry anyway." We were silent for another moment. Then she looked at me directly. "Are you going to disappear from my life?" It was the most important question of all, the one that mattered more than any apartment, any bank account, any legal process or strategic decision I had made in the last few days. And I answered it without hesitation. "Never," I said, "that doesn't change. Nothing that happened changes that." She nodded, and for the first time in days, I saw something in her face settle. Not happiness, not yet, but something more like certainty. To know that the floor was still there, even if everything else had moved. We stayed for another hour in that coffee shop. We drank coffee. We talked not about the legal details or the next steps, or Susanna, or Ruben. We talked about her plans, about college, about the future she had ahead of her that had nothing to do with the decisions of the adults around her, but only with what she wanted to build with her own life. And I listened to her with all the attention I'd always given her, with the same love as always, because that hadn't gone anywhere. That was never going away. It's been 4 months since Brenda's graduation day. 4 months since I sat in a white plastic chair in the hallway of an auditorium, while inside my wife made room for another man in the place that had always been mine. 4 months since I walked out of that apartment with a travel bag, a brown leather key holder, and the most important decision I had made in my adult life. And this morning I woke up in my own space, a small apartment, in a quiet building, in an area of the city I didn't know very well, but that in these weeks has been becoming familiar in that gradual and honest way that new places become home when you inhabit them with intention and not just out of inertia. It's a simple space, smaller than the previous apartment, without the expensive furniture or the decorative bookshelf or the wooden floor that cost a fortune to install. But everything in here I chose. Every detail is mine. There's nothing on these walls that exists to please someone else or to meet anyone's expectation but my own. It's the first time in 17 years I can say that. And it feels different from what I thought it would feel like. It doesn't feel like loss. It feels like space, like when you open a window that's been closed for too long and the air that comes in isn't perfect or particularly fragrant, but it's fresh and it's real. And it reminds you that outside there's a world that keeps moving and that you can move with it too. The formal separation process with Susanna took 3 months. Veronica handled everything with that direct efficiency she had promised me from day one. There were negotiations, there were tense moments, there were a couple of calls where Susanna tried arguments that had no legal basis and that Veronica dismantled with a professional patience I wouldn't have been able to maintain if I'd been in her place. Susanna tried to claim a part of the apartment sale, arguing that she had contributed to the household during the years of cohabitation. Veronica presented the bank records, the mortgage payment receipts, the account statements that proved that every cent of that property had come exclusively from my income for 10 years. The argument didn't hold up. She also tried to claim compensation for the years of marriage, based on her contribution to the home as a wife and mother figure. Veronica acknowledged that part, and we reached a reasonable agreement, a monthly amount for a defined period that seemed fair to me, given the context, not because I felt I owed it to her in moral terms, but because I understood that a clean break was more valuable than fighting indefinitely. What I didn't get was what no legal process could ever buy me. I didn't get the acknowledgement, I didn't get the real apology, I didn't get the moment when Susanna would look back with honesty and admit the weight of what she had done and what it had cost. It took me a while to accept that that moment wasn't going to come, that some people aren't capable of that level of honesty about themselves, not necessarily out of malice, but because of a more fundamental limitation, the inability to see themselves clearly enough to recognize the damage they cause, and that waiting for that acknowledgement was to keep tying myself to something that no longer belonged to me. I let it go, not all at once, not with a dramatic decision or a cinematic moment of revelation. I let it go slowly, like you let go of things that have been stuck for a long time, with patience, with repetition, with the daily decision not to go back to that pain, not to look for it, not to feed it. I heard almost nothing about Ruben directly. What had reached my ears through conversations with Brenda was enough to complete the picture. The man who had appeared with his gray suit and his late promises lasted about 6 weeks as the protagonist of the story Susanna had built in her head. Then the cracks began to appear, the same cracks that had always existed in him, and that 15 years of absence had kept hidden under the romantic layer of the unknown. It turned out that Ruben didn't have the prosperous business he had mentioned. He had debts. He had unfulfilled commitments. He had the same inability to be present that he had always had, only now he could no longer hide it behind distance, because he was there, right in front, being compared in real time to the daily reality of what it means to build a life with someone. Brenda told me without drama, with that maturity of hers that never ceases to amaze me. She said it had been a difficult process, that she had had to adjust the image she had of him with a real person she had met, and that although it hurt, it had also freed her from something she had carried for a long time without knowing exactly what it was. I told her that growing up always hurts a little, but that it's always worth it. She told me that sounded like something a dad would say. I told her that's exactly what I was. We laughed, and in that small, quiet laugh in an ordinary coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt that things, although different, although rearranged, although built on a different ground than I had imagined, could be okay. They could be real and solid and true in a different, but not lesser way. Brenda started college 6 weeks ago. She's studying graphic design at an institution she had always wanted to attend. I contributed to part of her tuition, not because I had any legal obligation to do so, but because I wanted to, because that's what a father does, not the one who signs a paper, but the one who chooses to be there. She sends me photos of her projects, tells me about her professors, asks my opinion on colors and compositions with the confidence of someone who knows that on the other side, there's someone listening with real attention. Last Wednesday, she sent me a picture of a poster she had designed for a class and asked me what I thought. I told her it was brilliant because it was... I haven't spoken with Susanna again beyond what was strictly necessary to close the final details of the formal process. There's no active resentment on my part, or at least not the kind of resentment that consumes you and keeps you tied down. There's a clear and necessary distance, the distance of someone who understands that certain doors close not out of anger, but for health. I know she's not doing well. I know the situation she's in is not easy, and there's a small part of me, the part that still remembers the woman from the 11th floor elevator with her folder under her arm, that regrets it in a genuine, though distant way. But there's also a much larger part that understands that what happened that day in the auditorium wasn't a communication error or a misunderstanding or the result of a difficult moment. It was the clearest and most honest expression of how Susanna saw me after 17 years. And you don't negotiate with that clarity. You act on that clarity. I acted. My life is quieter now than before. Simpler. There are things I miss, I won't lie. I miss the domestic routine of a house with more than one person, the background noise of someone else moving in the rooms, the shared presence of another human being in the everyday space. I miss some specific mornings, those Sunday mornings with coffee and slow light and no rush, that still appear in my memory with a sharpness I haven't asked for, but which I also can't avoid. But I don't miss the uncertainty. I don't miss walking through my own home feeling that something didn't fit and not knowing exactly what it was. I don't miss the feeling of building for someone who didn't value what was being built. I don't miss the silent weight of being invisible in the place I had paid for with my own time and my own money and my own love. I don't miss that. And on the scale of what I gained versus what I lost, when I'm completely honest with myself in the tranquility of these new mornings, the scale has no doubt about which way it tips. Julio asked me a few weeks ago if I regretted anything. I told him no, that the only thing I regretted was taking so long to understand that protecting myself wasn't a betrayal to anyone, that taking care of myself wasn't selfishness, but survival, that there's a huge difference between being generous and being invisible, and that I had confused those two things for too many years. He nodded. He told me he understood that well. I told him that if something similar ever happened to him, not to wait as long as I did. He laughed. I told him I was serious. This morning, before sitting down to write all this, I went for a walk in the new neighborhood. There's a small square 3 blocks from a building where I live, with medium-sized trees and a fountain that doesn't work well, but which still has something pleasant in its irregular and imperfect bubbling. I sat on a bench. I drank the coffee I had brought in a paper cup and stayed there for a long while. No rush, no agenda, without the weight of any expectation that wasn't my own. I thought about everything that had happened in the 17 years, about Brenda at 3 with her little pink shoes, about the apartment with the wooden floor, about the white plastic chair in the hallway, about the key that didn't open, about Susanna's message at midnight, about Brenda's face in the coffee shop telling me I'm sorry, Dad, with that simple and direct honesty that no adult had taught her, but that she simply had. And I thought about this moment in this square with this coffee in this silence, which isn't the silence of someone who has lost something, but the silence of someone who has finally found the space to listen to themselves. There's something I learned in these 4 months that I couldn't have learned in any other way. That true love isn't measured by how much you endure, but by when you decide that enough is enough. That dignity isn't negotiated in small daily installments, but is defended at the exact moment someone tries to take it from you. And that rebuilding your life after everything falls apart isn't the end of the story, but the beginning of the only version of it that truly belongs to you. I finished my coffee, got up from the bench, walked back to the building with my hands in my pockets, and the morning sun beginning to warm the streets of the neighborhood that's ceasing to be new and beginning to be mine. And I thought of something someone should have told me long ago, something I hope can help someone who right now is sitting in their own plastic chair in some hallway of their own life, putting up with what they shouldn't put up with, waiting for someone to see them. Don't wait for them to see you. See yourself first, because the day I stopped giving everything for someone who gave nothing, I didn't lose a family. I got back something much more important. I got myself back, and that, at 44 years old, in a square with a fountain that doesn't work well, taking the last sip of a paper cup coffee on an ordinary Tuesday, feels exactly how it's supposed to feel, like the beginning.